Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Turvey. I'm President and Executive Director of the Canadian Journalism Foundation, and it's my privilege to welcome you to today's special event, exploring the chilling tide of abuse faced by women journalists. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of the land that we are on today. While we meet on a virtual platform, we would like to take a moment to recognize the importance of the land that we each call home. The Canadian Journalism Foundation's office is situated on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and we are privileged to live and work in these territories. The CJF is thrilled to be presenting this important discussion today in collaboration with two partners, CBC Radio-Canada's Not OK campaign and the Canadian Women's Foundation. We are grateful for their support in bringing this conversation to our national audience. To say a few words about today's event, it is my pleasure to welcome a longtime friend and supporter of the CJF's work, Barbara Williams, Executive Vice President, English Services for CBC.
Thank you, Natalie, for that kind introduction and for organizing today's conversation. I'm so sorry I can't be with you in person, but in fact, as this tape is playing, I'm actually across town speaking live at a CBC event. So apparently it really is true. You just can't be in places at once. But never mind that. As she always does, Natalie has pulled together an incredible panel to discuss a hugely important topic. And while I'm admittedly a little biased, you also have a wonderful moderator in CBC's own Salimah Shivji. You know, as Canada's public broadcaster, CBC Radio-Canada has the unique responsibility to reflect all the diverse cultures, languages, and perspectives of Indigenous peoples and of all people in Canada. And we do this by seeking engaged journalists from a wide range of backgrounds and perspectives. But unfortunately, as we all know too well, Indigenous, racialized, and LGBTQ2+ media professionals often face the greatest abuse for simply doing their jobs, and that is so not okay. We protect all media professionals and their crews from harassment, violence, and then separately from the physical and verbal abuse, the attacks on journalists are systemic, designed to intimidate and dissuade independent, fact-based reporting and part of growing efforts to undermine democracy and democratic institutions. But encouragingly, in Canada and around the world, we're seeing momentum to stop these attacks. In fact, over the last 13 months, journalists Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to safeguard freedom of expression. 37 Canadian news media organizations came together to release a joint statement condemning online harassment of journalists. More than 40 public broadcasters and media associations from around the world signed the Brussels Declaration, demonstrating their commitment to supporting media professionals' safety and freedom of the press. And today's conversation is situated in this truly global movement, all part of the ongoing work to combat online harassment. CBC Radio-Canada is deeply committed to working with other media to raise awareness of the issue and most urgently to propose concrete steps to reduce it. Sadly, despite a lot of positive intentions and initiatives, the abuse continues, so we can't let up for a second. We must ensure we're doing everything we can to protect journalists, because enough is enough. And coming together as we are will ultimately foster a safer, stronger media. Thank you again for the invitation to start things off today. It's such an important issue. And okay, now back to you, Natalie.
Thank you, Barbara. A reminder that our discussion today is an hour long, and you can still submit questions for our speakers at any time via the tab on your screen. And if you'd like to tweet about today's conversation, our hashtag is Journalism Matters. According to research from the Coalition for Women in Journalism, Canada is the country where the most female journalists were exposed to organized troll campaigns this year. In conjunction with the 16 Days of Action Against Gender-Based Violence, our guests today will share their insights on online harm against women journalists, the challenges they face in doing their work, and perspectives on solutions and supporting others in the industry. A note before we introduce our panel, today's discussion may include topics or graphic details that are difficult for some of our viewers. We encourage our audience to take care of your mental health and well-being. I am delighted to introduce our panel. Joining us from Toronto, Garvia Bailey is the co-founder of Media Girlfriends. Also here in Toronto, we have Saba Eitizaz, the co-host and producer of Toronto Star's daily news podcast, This Matters. And in Calgary, independent journalist and the winner of the CJF and Canadian Women's Foundation's 2022 Landsberg Award, Christina Frangou. We are honored to have them with us. You're in great hands today leading this conversation. Please welcome from in Vancouver, Salimah Shivji, the India correspondent for CBC News. She will soon be heading to Mumbai to CBC's permanent bureau to cover important stories from the region and what they mean for Canada. Salimah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And I am really pleased to be part of this conversation, such a timely one when you see, of course, how the social media landscape is evolving, or perhaps devolving is a better word for what's happening in that space. And when you see the extent of online hate that's being directed at journalists, of course, predominantly journalists, female journalists, and more often than not, female journalists of color, and how that hate is really being amplified, death threats, racial slurs, misogynistic attacks. So all of us here, myself and the three amazing journalists on the panel, Saba, Christina, Garvia, we've all had to handle hate thrown our way simply for doing our jobs. We've had to handle that hate to varying degrees and through various means, but it's certainly not isolated, and it's getting worse, as you heard from what Natalie said. When you hear that more than 72% of journalists say that they were the victim of some form of harassment last year, that's a pretty alarmingly high figure. So we're going to delve into, I hope, how we cope and some of the solutions that news outlets are thinking of. But I want to start by getting a sense of the type of hate that we're seeing and the extent of it, sort of the intensity of it in this current climate. And so I want to start with you, Saba, if you don't mind. You've spoken out about being targeted, about becoming the subject of a seemingly highly organized hate campaign targeting you and several other journalists in Canada. Can you give us an idea of the type of vitriol that you received and sort of the scale of it and what it was like going through that?
Right. Thanks a lot, Salimah. I just want to start with, I usually have started, conversations with apologies, which I shouldn't have to, but I do because trauma strips you of your words and your story. And if there are, pauses in what I'm saying, or if I segue into another part of the conversation, I do apologize for that. I also want to start with saying that I have forgotten what safe looks and feels like for me, which is ironic because I came to Canada to be safe. I have now effectively been the target of hate in 2 countries. I was an international journalist in Pakistan, and I have experienced all of what I'm experiencing right now before in the form of a systemic and malicious cyber campaign against me. The violence was because of a lot of human rights reporting that I've done, which a lot of totalitarian forces in Pakistan and hyper-nationalist forces in Pakistan do not like. That violence eventually, because it carried on with such impunity, trickled into my real life. My car was ambushed. I have been given acid attack threats. I was afraid for my life and eventually had no choice but to come here. So Canada, for a lot of journalists who are, in countries where this kind of, repression of freedom of journalism is going on, is supposed to be a haven and a safe space. So it's sad to see that we are having this conversation here. It's sad to see the CFWIJ numbers on online hate in Canada. So I and my colleagues have basically been exhausted. It's been more than 2 years of this wave, like you mentioned, Salimah, started last fall. It started almost after Maxine Bernier's tweet talking about journalists, doxing certain journalists, and basically talking about playing dirty with journalists. And since then, we've seen a lot of political figures legitimize this message. we did not get any of the support and amplification and conversations that we are seeing now. Last year, it was left to a lot of racialized journalists who were undergoing the trauma of what was happening to them to get together, to try to understand that there's a pattern here, to collect the data, to start conversations about it. What I'm getting, I can tell you that it has nothing to do with my work. It's not a critique on my reporting. It has everything to do with my gender, my identity, my race, and where I'm from. I don't want to read any of that out because I think that I've tweeted about it enough. It's in a lot of publications for people to see. But the kind of graphic language and threats that are used on my person are almost physical in nature. Everything feels like, every word feels like a slap in the face. We already know that online violence and online abuse has the same effect on your mental health, on your physical health as actual physical trauma. I have been told to go back to my country. I've been told to either leave the journalism or Canada and go back to where I'm from. I have last year received a very graphic death threat, which through an encrypted email. So most of these threats are coming in through encrypted emails to me and my colleagues. I was told that I would be put in a burqa, put on my knees and executed with an AR-15 to the back of my head in a stadium full of cheering white men in purple garments. That was the first time when we had to reach out to file a complaint with the police because that was a death threat. Since then, these threats have gotten worse. They usually happen very well timed on a Friday. So I have a lot of time to think about it over the weekend when I'm supposed to have my time off. This year, I got an email which actually mentioned two other journalists, Erica Ifield of the Hill Times and Rachel Gilmore of Global News, and it talked about having our faces on a wall where the group was deciding who to silence, who to retire, and who to rape, and also told us to quit our journalism or we will be boogalooed the F out of Canada. And that's when we decided that we just can't keep taking this backlash, just going into our newsroom and individually, trying to deal with this problem. And I think that's where we kind of led to a collaborative newsroom-led effort where we had Global News, Hill Times, and the Toronto Star kind of get together to figure out what needs to be done about this wave of hate.
So you touched on so much there, and I want to get into all of that and pick it out in terms of obviously forgetting what safe looks like. I want to get to that in a second, though. First, I want to talk a little bit about what you said about how organized it was, right? You talked about, these encrypted emails and how sort of sophisticated the online attacks have become in a way. And I'll get back to you, Saba, but I also want to bring in Garvia and Christina into the conversation. When you guys hear that and the extent to which people go to send this hate towards journalists and journalists of color, I guess, how do you explain that? How do you feel about where this is going and what's fueling this type of hate in this country, in Canada in particular? Maybe Garvia, you can take that one first.
First, I just want to reach out through this means to all of the journalists, Saba, to hear and to witness what you and so many other journalists over the and it's not even over the last 2 years, it's become more virulent over the last few years for sure, but this is ongoing. It's something that especially since the birth of social media and it being a part of your job to be in those spaces, it's just completely it sets a chilling effect on any woman who feels like they'd like to speak out or have something to say, or even in support of the journalists and the women in their circles to say anything. And I think that's the point of these coordinated attacks is to silence through the means of terror. and you are able to terrorize enough women, enough journalists into being silent, then that's a part of the whole, I don't know what you want to call it, culture war or media war or information war. It's a form of warfare. And what I've seen and witnessed, and luckily over the last while have not had to experience, but the feeling, the residuals do the same thing. They're chilling. You don't want to step too boldly into that public sphere, and that is kind of the point of this sort of coordinated attack. So that's the way that I have witnessed it over the last little while. Is I see amongst my friends who are all in the journalism and media world that the conversations that we want to be having publicly, we only have privately because of this chilling effect, because of what we've seen journalists like Erica and Saba and et cetera go through. And that's not what we came into this into journalism for. That's not why we're here. We came here to be clarions and to be the ones that people can come to, and that we can be here to speak our truth and to speak the truth of whatever's going on the ground. And this is just a great way to silence that. So that's the way that I've been feeling through it. I'm not sure about you, Christina, but this has been horrific to witness.
It has. I don't think I've been on the screen, but I've been sort of nodding energetically here in my office, agreeing with you. And it's chilling is the right word. It's been shocking to see what has happened. And I want to start by sort of saying to Saba, Erica, and Rachel, and everyone who's been in the crosshairs of these attacks, your work has been tremendous, given what you have been under. And I think that needs to be recognized, like the quality of work that these journalists are doing, despite these ongoing attacks that I know keep wearing people down and make it difficult to say anything. And, we watch what's happening in other countries and people talking about physical attacks on journalists and journalists being put in prison and more sort of organized attacks from a state level to stop the act of journalism. But this is censorship as well. And it's very hard to speak out. And we did see journalists who spoke out in support of women journalists of color. We saw, the attacks just grow, the number of people that were sort of in their crosshairs, and that's wrong. And I would like to see all of us sort of speaking out, and that's freelancers, that's newsrooms, that's people outside the world of journalism, to say that this is wrong, because this work is really important.
Yeah, that's interesting, Christina. You talked about speaking out and the importance of speaking out, but of course that is also so difficult when you're dealing with trauma and when you're trying to cope and you're trying to actually continue doing your jobs. And I want to get at that. I want to talk, about specific help from news organizations and what managing editors do in a minute. But first, I want to just talk personally. Saba, how do you deal with that hate, and what are the sort of coping mechanisms that you've developed along the way? You talked about, joining a little bit with some others who are going through it. How do you develop a path to keep going and to keep doing this job when it gets so difficult and you're being bombarded with some of that online hate?
I think a lot of it is, I think journalists are conditioned. It's our trauma response to keep operating on muscle memory. I think I can't speak to everybody because everybody has a different coping mechanism and why they continue to do this work. I also know that there are journalists in much more perilous job positions than me, who are much more vulnerable, freelancers, people who do not have newsroom-led initiatives, like supporting them in whatever manner, which we should also talk about, but they don't even have that, and they are self-censoring. They are moving away from journalism. They are not there to tell important stories that are a part of the Canadian narrative. We already talk about the underrepresentation in the Canadian media landscape, and now there's a concerted effort being made right in front of us to push those really important voices out. So to answer your question, like a lot of people are not coping well. I think continue on muscle memory. I work in this job because I have seen that the stories that we tell, the facts that we talk about or disseminate, they matter. They matter more than ever now in this it's not a post-pandemic world, but a pandemic world where polarization has led to, a global movement of sort of fueling, hyper-nationalist or hate-filled groups. And when we talk about polarization and we say Canada has seen a lot of, sort of disenchantment since the anti-masking movement happened, since the Ottawa convoy happened, it's not the majority of Canadians. It's actually specific far-right groups that have fueled that confusion, that have fueled that time of disenfranchisement for many to build up on their hate campaigns to silence and erase people like us. So I've seen the greatest price that can be paid if we stop working at a time like that in Pakistan, where important voices in journalism have been pushed out, are in exile like me, have been assassinated, have been abducted. And when there is an information vacuum, who takes over that vacuum? It's bad players. It's people who want to manipulate reality and manipulate the facts to exert more totalitarianism or problematic structures. So I don't want that to happen. And also I refuse to cede my space. I've never ceded my space for any, to any kind of authoritarianism or bullying. So I'm motivated by that, but it's not really coping. I'm just going on, because when we talk about the trauma from this stuff, it's not, we always associate it with mental or emotional well-being, but trauma plays has a huge impact on your physical being. And, you burn out, you get sick. We also, there are intersectional issues here. We talk about journalists, the disproportionality of, journalists of color burning out or quiet quitting or leaving this industry. And it's all kind of related to that. So, so that's how I'm coping, but not everybody is.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to mention. Not everybody is, and coping is one thing, right? And I think all of us were nodding when you talked about the wider effects of burnout, of feeling dispirited when you see what's happening to the industry and the online hate that's taking over in some cases. I want to throw it to you, Garvia. How do you sort of cope with where you see this going? You've worked a long time in this industry. You've been with legacy media and worked on your own as well. So when you see the direction it's going in, I guess, what are sort of those coping mechanisms that you may use? And I'll get to you, Christina, in a second with a similar question. Garvia, what do you think?
I think it's just so important for us to be able to band together and to find our communities within ourselves, within our groupings of especially racialized journalists, women of color, or just women journalists in general. That has been the for any kind of trauma that I've been through. It has been those groups that I can go to, the groups of journalists that have become a part of my social circle that are integral to my own mental health. And so having those supports is crucial. Like, if you don't have those supports, please reach out to me. Like, I want to be, a support to as many as possible. I mean, Media Girlfriends was birthed out of that, out of the need for us to come together and be each other's support. So that's one way to cope that has worked for me over the years.
Yeah, that support system, obviously very important. But when you're a freelancer, when you're on your own, things change a little bit with your support system as well. Doesn't Christina, I want to throw that to you. You work as a freelancer. I mean, how does that sort of inform the jobs you perhaps choose to take, or how you weigh situations when you know that sometimes you don't have a big media organization behind you and a colleague that you can call and be intimately involved in the story with.
For sure. Well, I will say that I think this has changed the way freelancers talk among themselves and look after each other. And we do have some organized support groups, but we also have very informal sort of groups of friends that look after each other. And I would also say, if there's anybody watching this who is freelancing and who is struggling and is trying to figure out what you say and what you don't say and how to take on these challenges, please reach out. We have a good group of freelancers in Canada, especially those of us who have been at this a long, long time. And we're going to keep working to make sure that we're looking after as many freelancers here as possible. So for me, I've been a freelancer for almost 20 years, so a really long time. And when I started, the problems you would have is sort of like one source that or one person that just kept calling you, maybe kept emailing you. And that was kind of it. But now it's part of your job as a freelancer is also marketing yourself. And it's commenting on things. It's like doing the work to make sure that people share your stories. And it means that people learn more about you and they learn more about your networks. And so I have to be careful about what I say about my family and who I'm connected to and where I might be. If I'm working on a story and I am going into a place by myself, I always make sure that someone knows. I have sort of a system that someone sort of will call after a certain amount of time and check in just to make sure that I'm okay. And I also pick my assignments a little differently. If I think I'm in territory that's uncomfortable for me in some ways, I make sure I'm working with an editor I know I can trust. And you will learn who those editors are, who stand up for you, who check in with you. I do a lot of writing and stories that like of people who have just sort of been through hell and back, like spending a lot of time with people in some of their worst moments. And you need to make sure that you have a team around you that knows how to look after you in that situation. And so there's a lot of political stories I don't touch because it's not to me worth the risk. That said, I do a lot in sort of vaccinations and gender-based violence, and both of these sort of open the door to a whole bunch of emails that I really would not like to receive. But that's the trade-off I make. I'm constantly talking though to other writers and to editors about, do you think this risk is worth it? What would you do if this happened? And then when we see someone sort of being slammed online, I tend to reach out, and I know other people do that to me, just to make sure, are you okay?
You talked about not doing some stories, like not doing some of those political stories because of the risk involved. I mean, would you do those stories if that risk wasn't there? Is that a loss in your career in a way?
I don't know if those stories are a loss, but there are things I don't take on within the world of health, or I wouldn't sort of say in marketing stories, and that probably has an effect on my career. I don't have institutional support, and we've seen sort of frivolous lawsuits against staff reporters, against freelancers, against scientists, and so I have to be a little bit careful about what I'm going to say, because I don't have the institutional support to back me up if someone decided they just wanted to throw me under the bus.
Yeah, and that's important, I think, just to think about. Obviously, it does have an effect on your career, even if it's not as overt. It affects you internally, right? When you're sort of handling these things and dealing with the hate thrown your way. So we've been talking about support systems from people, from colleagues, but I want to get into how much support is there from larger news organizations when you're going through something so major. So Saba, we've seen some of obviously CBC, Radio-Canada, a lot of other news outlets banding together and kind of talking about certain solutions and how to sort of tackle this. What do you see happening out there from the larger news outlets to tackle the online hate that you're still going through?
Right. I actually want to start with saying that we need to just clear this sort of distinction between freelancers and like people who are working for the organization. If a freelancer is doing a story for you, they've pitched it, you've commissioned it, they're basically a part of your organization. They are deserving of the same protocols, of the same support, and the same safety. And it shouldn't be on a case-to-case basis. Like, oh, maybe I'll get a good editor, or maybe I'll get a good team. This should be entrenched in the newsroom protocol. We have seen how problematic this is. Salimah, you're setting up the Delhi bureau, and I've worked in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and the way stringers and fixers are treated over there, who are at the front line, who are risking their lives, basically doing a lot of the story. We know how the dynamics work, bringing in that nuance, and then they are the most vulnerable once an international journalist does their story. They finish it off and they leave the country, leaving them behind to deal with that. So freelancers and their rights and how they're part of the mainstream organization that there should be a conversation. In terms of support, I think we've come a little bit further from, I've heard from journalists here from before who said, well, I used to get a check-in call from my manager and that was it, because that is not the way to move forward with this. Since then, I think since last year, there were a lot of newsrooms working on ways to protect their journalists, but they were working in siloized environments. I think this year when, this happened, I think for the first time, Erica, I, and Rachel kind of got together in each other's DMs, and we started talking about this, and then we reached out to, and Erica is a freelancer, by the way, but it should never have come up, and it never came up as a conversation because we were all journalists working for our respective organizations. We did get our newsroom, like senior leadership together on this to work out collaborations, because the only way we're going to be able to protect our journalists systemically is through collaborating with other newsrooms, getting best practices from those who might be leading on this a little bit. And just one point that I have to make is like, there can be some stories that you can stop doing, or your, editor could protect you from, like, maybe this is a story that can imperil you, but that doesn't apply to everybody. As a racialized journalist, the mere fact that I'm existing on this space, the mere fact that I look the way I do and I speak the way I speak is enough for these attacks to happen to me. When this recent wave of hate came towards me, I actually had disassociated from my social media because I was so exhausted, and the least I did was just like promote my episode, like, just like retweet it or something. Yet the hate kept coming. So it's not even about how much should I censor myself, or which stories should I not cover or cover. It's basically about me being silenced and erased and just drawing back into the curtains or the sidelines. So, I mean, that doesn't help. And I think journalists need to come up with an internal system for tracking, because before that, they used to just, I think there were the CBC and a couple of other organizations started quarantining some of these hate mails. But at the same time, there needs to be a tracking mechanism, because when it's a danger of this kind, when it's a systematic and organized threat, I think journalists need to be vigilant, and they need to see what the nature of the threat is, whether they need to assess their safety. So we need to see the content. It can't just be like blocked, out of sight, out of mind. So what the Toronto Star did in this respect is that we do have now a quarantine in place, because a lot of our journalists were being targeted, but then there's like a buffer zone so we can mentally prepare. So there's a senior editor who basically gets those emails. I feel bad for them. And then they get in touch with whichever journalists have been mentioned, and they say, well, this has come, and would you like to see it? So that kind of creates a mental protection, gives you a beat to prepare, and then it's up to you whether you want to see it or not. I have not yet met any journalists who don't want to know the kinds of threats that are coming at them, and to prepare. Secondly, I feel like there need to be internally peer-led efforts, because when I was at the BBC, we have a practice called TRIM, which is a trauma response management system, where our peers, our colleagues are trained to assess, do like a small questionnaire, assess for trauma, for the impacts of something bad that's happened to another reporter, and then they can advocate for their colleagues and for their peers to like maybe get the time off that they need, maybe have a better work-life balance, or just like have better working conditions as they're going through this. So I think that's something we should be seeing within our newsrooms as well. And thirdly, I think what we just saw this year was something really important, where we had, three newsrooms basically getting together to figure out how do stakeholders, get pressurized around the world when we talk about hate, this kind of polarization and this kind of online hate. We do see like a collaboration of stakeholders trying to figure out a solution. So I think more ventures like the collective message that was sent out by 48 organizations to all stakeholders that this is a serious threat. It's not an attack against one journalist. This is not an isolated incident. This is not some person in their basement sending us messages. This looks like an incredibly hostile and systemic, apparently systemic campaign, and that these news organizations consider that an attack on journalism and on the press, and not just that individual journalist, and they'll stand together to find solutions for that. So I think these are some of the things that have started. I think a lot more still needs to be done, but it's a start.
Can I just say that, sorry, Christina,
Go ahead.
that I felt like through this process, all of these things, all of these responses from news organizations, it was frustrating to see how slowly that happened, and the fact that it wasn't a sort of a top-down response. It was those that were being targeted that said, this is what needs to be done. And I can't help but feel like that was a failing and a lack of vision in terms of how you lead a news organization. And as much as we can celebrate and laud organizations for doing the work should have been done and ready because we saw this coming. It wasn't like these sorts of attacks came out of nowhere. So I hope that some of the initiatives that Saba was talking about that are happening at the BBC, it doesn't take more attacks and an escalation for some of these initiatives to actually be implemented in a timely fashion, not having these journalists not only do the work of journalism, but then have to advocate for their own safety and have to bang on doors to say, you need to do something as an organization to protect me and my fellow journalists. That to me is somewhat unacceptable. And I'd love to see the responses just be a little bit less reactionary and with a little bit more vision and thought and care.
And I just want to quickly add that it took us a really long time to even convince newsrooms and other stakeholders that this was some kind of a pattern and this was a systemic campaign of some sort. Everybody was treating it like an isolated incident. Initially, like Garvia said, we had to get together, make these sort of databases to prove our point. And it's exhausting. Like, you're already dealing with this backlash of like hate and the trauma that comes with it. And then you're like dealing with believability or trying to explain to like newsroom leadership why this is a problem and what it's doing to you. And I think it's also really important to have adequate representation in, senior executive positions in newsrooms, because it makes a difference for somebody to understand the nuance of like what my experience as a racialized person is. And when somebody is making a specific reference to a burqa, or they're talking about a stadium execution, what the relevance there is, they're talking about like, it's a Taliban reference, right? It's the things that you need to have to explain, because, there have been times when I've had to explain to certain people, like, they're like, how is this a threat? Like, I don't think this is actually, maybe it's just, and then I've had to kind of explain the context and the nuance of it. And it would really make a difference if we had people who understand that experience and who had that nuance already in those senior positions to advocate for us.
And I'll add that there are organizations in Canada who the bylines that appear in their pages are primarily freelancers, and they have yet to sign the letter from the Canadian Association of Journalists. And I would love to see them there, because these are the names of the people that are doing these stories, and the people who are most likely to be targeted. So the easiest thing you could do is sign your name to this letter in support, knowing that the people who are doing the work in your pages are freelancers. The other thing is, in terms of what can happen with emails, like, sure, a newsroom can have someone come through and sort of go through them. You don't have that as a freelancer, but I would love to see magazines and newspapers, if you bought a story from a freelancer and it results in them sort of being inundated with these hate messages, give them IT supports to help get them through this, because it's a lot to manage on our own. And the other thing I think is that what we're seeing in freelancer contracts is a little bit frightening to me. Like, we're seeing, these sweeping changes to sort of moral rights and indemnity clauses. And that means that, there's going to be, at some point, someone is going to say, I don't want my name on that. But if they don't have sort of moral rights on that story, the story could go out edited with their name on it, and they know, the journalists will know that's about to expose them to a whole bunch of attacks, but there's nothing they can do about it. And so I think that magazines and newspapers can start to make changes at the contract level that gives more protection to journalists and leaves them a little less vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Just to expand a bit more on the idea of support, what about people who are watching this unfold and say they want to help, or they're there to support you? How would you guide them towards real and concrete support instead of perhaps empty words like, I'm here for you? Does that mean much if it's not backed up by something? Garvia, maybe you want to take that one.
Well, I think the question that everyone that is watching these things as they unfold, colleagues, friends, whoever, you see it happening on social media. You see it with your own eyes, and then you have to ask the question: how much discomfort will I tolerate in service to what I stand for? So you can say to yourself, you can, hit a like button. Lovely, great. What is the discomfort that you will tolerate to actually change this? Will you go and walk into a newsroom yourself and knock on your managing editor's door and say that this is intolerable and I can't stand for this? As someone that might have, what we're dealing with is a lot of power dynamics that are bubbling to the surface, and this is a part of that, but it's also those power dynamics, we're seeing them in play as the reactions to these sorts of situations unfold, right? So who has power in a newsroom, who has power in the transactional part of journalism when we see how these things unfold. So those people that talk about allyship and that want to be a part of the solution, what is it that you will tolerate in becoming uncomfortable in the privilege that you have of being just you and not having to think about, if I tweet in support of this, what's going to come back at me for the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, year? Am I going to have to think about trauma, my own trauma, if I tweet this support of this one thing? There's a lot of people that are sitting in our newsrooms that don't have to think about that at all. They just do whatever. So I think that the challenge is to say to those that have that sort of power and that kind of privilege, what is it that you're willing to do? How much of your neck are you willing to put on the line to support your colleagues that are doing this hard work? You never have to think about it when you wake up. If I tweet this thing or if I support this little thing, I do it all the time. I'm just about to hit like, or just about to type something, and then I erase it all because I don't want the heat. So who will take the heat for us? And I think that those are the hard questions that individuals have to ask themselves. Will you be willing to talk in a way and be very vocal in a way that's not performative?
So that sort of leads into one of the audience questions. We are taking questions from folks out there, and you did touch on this, Garvia, but I'll give this one to Christina. This is from Brent, who says, as a male journalist, how do I support my women colleagues in journalism or my friends as they're going through this? What's the best way to do it? I mean, Garvia did touch on that, but what do you think, Christina?
Well, I think Garvia is brilliant, and that was exactly the response is speak out, speak up, and show your support. Be public in your support, but also be behind the scenes in your support. I honestly I could never say it better than Garvia just did.
Brilliant. Agreed. Show your support and listen as well, like deeply listen to what's happening. And I think we're doing that here. So some more
I think just reaching out to your colleague, reach out to your colleague and just, slide into their DMs and say that I see exactly what's happening. And how would you like me to react? Do you need me to advocate on your behalf? Do you need me to think about what the skin that you're in, the power that gives you, the inherent power. What can I do to advocate on your behalf is something that I would love to see more, folks like Brent or whoever do. How can I help you? What can I do that is non-performative, that will actually help to move the dial on this thing?
Absolutely. Another audience question. Several people actually have sent this one in, so I don't have everybody's names because it is a constant. First of all, a lot of people are saying kudos and thank you for everybody for being open on this panel and speaking about what you're dealing with. But a lot of people are talking about the police and the police's role in all of this. So I'm going to give this one to Saba. A lot of people are asking what sort of help is the police doing? Are the police offering? How serious are they when they get some of these complaints? I mean, you had to report a lot of this on your own and handle that process. What issues do you see in how the police are handling this type of online hate directed at female journalists?
So, I think we get this a lot, whenever we talk about being victim to this kind of hate, we are told, why didn't you go to the police? The police will help. Get a lot of DMs about that. And I just want to talk about what you're sending a victim into. You're telling them they're dealing with this wave of hate, and you're asking them to basically sacrifice their time, their sanity, their working hours to be a part or to seek help from basically a system that's now outdated, that's not able to keep up with the digital threat that we are facing. And that's also historically, there's a relationship of mistrust with the police system and racialized communities. And you're asking journalists to jump through hoops to report that, who are also parents, siblings, they have families. And let me tell you how much of my life was, because we decided to become these inadvertent case studies for what happens, if you do report to the police. Most of my, I think, summer was spent doing this and just working on auto. So all of us were targeted across 3 jurisdictions. That's Ottawa, Edmonton, and Toronto. There were at least 10 journalists who were affected. Everybody was getting, at that time, because the 3 newsrooms were collaborating, so there was support from editorial, and we were asked to report. First of all, the police system does not allow to report these incidents collectively. For example, even if your editor who actually wanted to, buffer this situation a little, my editor did, and they said, we can file a report on the behalf of our newsroom because there were so many reporters who were getting these messages. So it's a newsroom problem. The police does not allow for that system. The police wants you to report individually and personally. So how does that go was kind of different across 3 jurisdictions. It was equally gaslighty and dysfunctional, but I think it kind of, the way the interactions built out were different based on how you sounded, what you looked like. Everybody was on hold with the police for hours and hours. We all reported that we were doing our daily reporting while being on hold for the police, while being bombarded with death and rape threats. I think after several hours got through to a police officer who really didn't bother to listen to me. It seemed like the first few sentences out of my mouth were just not, it kind of started making me think, is it my accent? What is it about how I'm conveying this, that this person is not taking me seriously when I'm telling them there are death threats, there is a rape threat. It's been happening since last year. They have a report filed for a death threat since last year, which they never followed up on. He said something very vague about I'll email you, send me all of this stuff, and we're going to these are encrypted emails. They're probably not even from the country. And pretty much every reference in those emails is like a very Canadian reference, and like he hasn't even looked at it, and he said that. I think my colleagues across the other jurisdictions had similar experiences where eventually, like one or two of my colleagues did get reports filed, and then there was this constant weird lack of coordination going on where the Ottawa police kept telling, Rachel, for instance, that the Toronto police is looking into it. Meanwhile, the Toronto police hadn't even filed a case or spoken to any of us. And then they pushed it back onto the Ottawa police. And then there was this weird back and forth. I never got a call back. During that time, I received 2 more horrific threats. Other people were receiving emails with my name in it, with specific rape and death threats. So like other colleagues were getting back to me, telling me you've been mentioned in this. I kept sending this person all of those emails. I told him about my perilous status in this country, my security. I begged that I need some guidance as to make myself secure. I was ghosted by this person. I eventually had to amplify this on social media. I still didn't get a call from him. I got a response from the PR department of the police. It took us, I think, several months, a collective letter signed by 48 organizations, a tweet by Minister Mendocino and Prime Minister Trudeau, and a letter by him before I got my first reach out from a detective. And I was told that the case had been elevated. By that time, I really didn't have it in me to continue the process further because it was so devastating and erasing on top of the other things that I was facing. So I feel like there are not only systemic issues. Obviously, this is, what I think to me, systemic discrimination, systemic racism looks like, where you're putting so much of your life on hold to try to get some protection from a system that's not prepared or does not have the political will to look out for you. But there are also several, procedural issues here. There are problems with them understanding how encrypted emails or how digital landscapes and the hate that comes from there is an actual threat. They encourage some of my colleagues to report online. There is actually no category online, no space online to report online threat, which is ironic. So they give you like a place to put up pictures for like hate speech on graffiti or something, but there's no actual category to report this. And then they were, my colleagues were also told that some of this doesn't meet the legal threshold for a threat. So I don't understand what does. If they're talking about surveilling us, they talked to a couple of my colleagues have said they've been following them. They've talked about specifically graphic threats about what they will do. What do I need? Do I need somebody outside my door wanting to inflict harm before I can call a police officer to ask for protection? So that's been our experience. And we are journalists who are aware of the processes, who are able to advocate for ourselves. Just imagine how it goes for somebody who is not any of those things and is a racialized person trying to report violence.
So many struggles in terms of getting people to pay attention and deal with this. I want to fit in 2 more questions. We only have a few more minutes though, but I want to touch on that in terms of a great question from Caitlin and a similar one from Arlene. They both asked, how can you get social media corporations, operating the platforms where online hate and harassment occurs? Like, how do you get them to do better? Should there's be more issues about anonymity and banning that? That's a very big question. But I wonder if, Garvia, you can take it for a couple of minutes.
Well, first, don't sell your social media company to Elon Musk. Like, that is probably your first line of defense, is like, don't have it in the hands of just the worst individuals. I feel like it has to be, as much as we see these spaces as, these democratic places where free speech is the be all and end all, there has to be policing in those spaces. There has to be a time when those social media companies have to take responsibility. And once again, it's a power thing. When Saba talks about the fact that there was that the police would not take, they would only take individual statements, when we know that this is a systemic thing. All it takes is, like, if the police were being approached from the right people, and I'm telling you, it always has to be the right people, then you know that the reaction would be different. And it's the same with the social media companies where this hate is able to proliferate so easily, and harassment is rampant. So as much as we hate to say it, we need to be on the asses of our elected officials, on the higher ups in every office. If Prime Minister Trudeau loves women so much, we need to be banging on every door to say that this is a thing, man. Like, I just don't understand why this isn't a part of the political conversation, because it's just massive. Like, where is the freedom of press? This is not a free press at this point. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think it does. I think there's a lot of good points in there. We only have a couple more minutes, but I do want to end it on one question Kelsey sent in this one. I'm going to modify it slightly, so I hope you don't mind, Kelsey. I want to talk a little bit about aspiring journalists, new journalists, right? So Kelsey wants to know what drew you into journalism. Christina, I wonder if you want to take this, and I'll just add, would you weigh that decision differently now, considering the landscape that a female journalist is getting into in terms of how much hate there is out there? I mean, things have changed so much.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this last night, and would I do this again? I don't know, and I will tell you, to an aspiring journalist out there, like when a story works the way you envisioned it would work, when someone comes to you with something, their story, and it matters so much, and they give you sort of the privilege and the responsibility of escorting that out into the world, there's nothing better than that feeling when you feel like you've done a good job on it. And I still, after all this time, haven't walked away. And so there's something that is keeping me here. I do hope that our newsrooms, our journalism schools, our mentors know how to talk about safety in a different way than they did when I was starting out, because it was just like you just went and you did things. You went into places with sort of no cell phone, no support, and nothing like that. And I think that if you are starting out, know your people who have your back. Make sure that your editor is sort of looking out for you. And yeah, it can still really be, a dream job when it all works out. And I think there are a lot of people fighting to make sure that we can keep journalism a safe and rewarding place to be.
You know what? We could go on for hours on this topic. I really wish we had a little bit more time. I think we should end it there in terms of the time, because we do have to get to a video, but I want to say thank you. Can't thank you all enough for taking the time to actually be on this panel, to share your experiences and to talk a little bit about solutions and a little bit about what so much more needs to be done. So just the fact, I think, that we're having this conversation makes a difference. The fact that it's out there and talking about what needs to be done and what can be tackled. So thank you guys so much, all of you, all three of you, and thanks to everyone listening. Sorry I didn't get to everybody's question. They were really good ones. And with that, I'll pass it over to Paulette from the Canadian Women's Foundation for a final thought.
Hello, everyone. My name is Paulette Senior, President and CEO of the Canadian Women's Foundation. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to our amazing panelists for bravely sharing their experiences and insights. I'm appreciative of the work that diverse women and equity-seeking reporters do to tell hidden stories and expose gender injustice and human rights gaps. Your voices are needed now more than ever. You need to be free and safe to tell the stories that only you can tell. And the stories in Canadian media these days are incredible, enabling truth to be spoken to power like I've never seen. I'm particularly awed by the strong feminist journalists that are emerging today. But no one can function in a barrage of insults and harassment and abuse and threats to violence. It's not right. It's not sustainable. These things should not be seen as just part of the job. As with any form of gendered violence, stopping this abuse requires systemic change. Committed leaders need to create better policies and working conditions for their journalists. We need real consequences for abuse, harassment, and criminal behavior. And we need relevant supports for women and equity-seeking journalists. The strength and sustainability of our media landscape requires it. And a strong media landscape is critical to our civic and democratic health. So, as you continue to do your work, we'll do ours and keep pushing for change. Thank you, everyone.